Hey everyone, Howard Pinsky here. I don't know about you guys, but I can go for a nice juicy burger right now. A little bit of ketchup, a little bit of mustard, maybe some lettuce. Now, why am I telling you this? Well, today's Photoshop tutorial is brought to you by Burger Lab on the Tasted channel by Top Chef Richard Blassie. Now, if you haven't seen Burger Lab, take a look at this clip.
Join us in the lab where we're going to explore every possible thing you can do to the hamburger. We're going to season, stuff, perfectly grill, griddle, baste, barbecue, fry, smoke, melt, layer, sauce, and bun.
That looks pretty delicious to me, so make sure to subscribe to their channel, click on this annotation right here, and in this Photoshop tutorial, we're going to be creating something similar to what you saw at the end of that clip. We're going to be engraving text into wood in Photoshop. Let's go ahead and begin. So to start off this project, all you really need is a texture. It can be wood, it can be metal, it can be grass, it doesn't matter what you want to use, you just need some form of texture. Now this texture I'm using here was found over at Shutterstock.com. I do use them because they have really high quality textures, but of course you can go to cgtextures.com or you can even go to Google to find a texture of your choice. And the second thing you need is text. Now, as is the case with many of my text-based tutorials, I always say the thicker the font, the better. Especially if you're going to be adding a bevel and emboss, which we're going to be adding, it gives you more room to work with, especially around the edges, so you don't have a lot of crowding and overlapping going on. For this project, I'm going to be using the Wood Stevens font, which I found over at dafont.com, dafont.com. And I'm going to simply type out my word of choice. In this case, it'll be my first name, right in the middle of the document. And the color of the font doesn't matter at this point because we're going to be setting the fill to 0. And once you have your text typed out, we can go ahead and start adding layer styles. Now when you first double click on your layer to bring up the layer styles dialog box, you want to stay in the blending options section just for a moment. Right under advanced blending, we're going to be setting the fill opacity to 0. Now you don't want to set the opacity to 0, which you can find above. The difference between opacity and fill opacity, if you set the fill opacity to 0, you'll still be able to see the layer styles which we're about to add. But if you set the opacity to 0, those layer styles will also be affected, so you won't be able to see them. So now with that done, let's go ahead and add some layer styles. Let's start with a bevel and emboss. Because we want this text to be engraved into the wood, we're going to set the style at emboss, the technique at chisel hard, and the direction to down. Of course, if you want the text coming out of the wood, you can set the direction to up. Now, as for the values, I'm going to increase the depth to around 200% and the size to around 30 pixels. And as always, if you're designing on a larger or smaller document with a larger or smaller font, you may need to adjust the values that you see in this video. Now, down below under shading, we're going to keep the angle and altitude the same. We're going to keep the gloss contour the same, but we're going to be changing the highlight mode to overlay and then decreasing the opacity to 25%. Now for the shadow mode, we're going to keep it at multiply, but we're going to decrease the opacity to 50%. Next, to give the engraving a little bit of an edge on the inside, we're going to be adding a contour to our bevel. From the contour picker, go ahead and select the Cove Deep Contour, and then keep the range at whatever it's set to. Finally, to finish off the bevel, to give it a little bit more of a realistic feel, we're going to be adding a texture. When you're in the pattern picker, it's a good idea to experiment with the different patterns that are available to see which works best with your document. But for this design, I'm going to be selecting the metal landscape pattern, which is this one right down here. And then when that's selected, I'm going to leave the scale at 100%, but I'm going to decrease the depth to 5%. I only want a very subtle texture. Good. The next thing we're going to be adding is an inner shadow to give a little bit more depth to our design. I'm going to be keeping the blend mode at multiply, the opacity at 75%, keep the angle at 120 degrees, but I'm going to increase the distance to around 40 pixels and the size to around 20. Again, if you're using a larger or smaller font, you may need to adjust these values accordingly. And finally, to finish off the layer styles, I'm going to be adding an outer glow to interact with the wood surrounding the text. The blend mode for this outer glow is going to be set to color burn, and then I'm going to decrease the opacity quite a bit to around 15%. When that's done, I'm going to crank the size all the way up to 250 pixels, and then increase the spread to around 20%. This will add some nice burning around our text on the wood behind it. And that'll do it for the layer styles. It's looking okay, but it's far from complete. What we're going to do now is we're going to make a duplicate of our wood texture layer and place it inside of our text layer so we can alter the color a little bit. So go ahead and make your background layer active, and with your Command or Control key held down, press the letter J on your keyboard to make a copy of that layer. And once it's been duplicated, you can simply drag it right above your text layer that we just worked on. And once it's in place, we need to place this texture inside of the text. Now there are two ways of doing so. You can either add a clipping mask or you can add a layer mask. In many cases, I would just go for a clipping mask, but because the text layer has a bunch of layer styles on it, and because we're going to be working with the blend if controls, I'm going to be adding a layer mask for this example. So you'll want to go ahead and turn your text into a selection. You can very easily do this by holding down your Command key on the Mac, Control key on Windows, and clicking on the Type Layers thumbnail in your Layers panel. You should see the marching ants running around your text. Once that's done, press the Add Layer Mask button at the bottom of your Layers panel to hide everything else outside of that selection. Now, to alter the color of this texture, we're going to be adding a brightness and contrast adjustment layer. Of course, you can add a levels or curves adjustment layer, but brightness and contrast is a very simple adjustment layer and it does the trick. When the adjustment layer has been added, you can adjust the brightness and contrast in your properties panel to get the result that you're looking for. In this case, I'm going to be darkening up the texture. So I'm going to be decreasing the brightness to around -75, and then I'm going to crank up the contrast all the way to 100. Now you may be noticing that this adjustment layer is affecting the whole entire image. We don't want that. We only want it to affect the texture that we just added. So at the bottom of the properties panel, you're going to want to press this icon right here, which is going to clip that adjustment layer to the texture layer right below it. And that's looking a little bit better. But you might be noticing that the inner shadow that we added is no longer visible. So what's going on and how do we fix this? Well, there are a few things that we can do, including changing the blend mode. But if you've seen some of my past text-based tutorials, I love using blend if, which allows us to blend this texture with the tones of the layer underneath it. So if you double click on the new texture layer to bring up the layer styles dialog box, take a look at the bottom of the window, you'll see the blend if section. And in this case, we want to blend this texture with the texture underneath it, which is the underlying layer. Now, if I were to simply drag the shadow slider of the underlying layer to the right, I'm going to get a very harsh result. So what I want to do is I want to split this slider to give a much more gradual result. So with my Option key on the Mac or Alt key on Windows held down, I'm going to drag the right side of the shadow slider to the right until I have a nice blend. Somewhere around 120 should work well. And you'll see that we can now see that inner shadow that we added earlier. Now, if you chose to use a lighter or darker texture, you may need to play around with the sliders a little bit. You may need to drag it a little bit more to the right, a little bit less, or you may need to drag the highlight slider instead of the shadow slider. When creating designs like this, it's all about experimentation. Now, the final thing I'm going to be adding to this design is a gradient fill adjustment layer. So I want to make sure I have the topmost layer selected and then add the gradient fill adjustment layer from the adjustment layer button at the bottom. I'm basically going to be using this to add a little bit of vignette or burning around the edges of my textures. So for the gradient, I want to start with the foreground to transparent gradient, and if the colors are not set to black, go ahead and click on the gradient to bring up the gradient editor, and then set both colors to black. And then once that's set, I'm going to set the style to radial, the angle to 90 degrees, and then I'm going to turn on reverse at the bottom so the vignette is around the edges and not in the middle. And then you may want to increase the scale so the vignette is only around the edges of your textures. Now, to blend the gradient in a little bit better with the background, we're going to be changing the blend mode, and we're also going to be working with blend if again. So double click on the gradient fill adjustment layer to bring up the layer styles again, and we're going to change the blend mode to linear burn, and then decrease the opacity to around 75%. Now again, at the bottom we can work with our blend if controls. Now for this one, we're going to be blending with the highlights of the underlying layer. So hold down Alt or Option and drag the left side of the highlight slider to the left. Somewhere around 70 should work well. And that'll give our gradient a nice blend with the background and should finish off our design. So in a few very simple steps, you've now taken your text and engraved it into the texture of your choice. As I mentioned, designs like this are all about experimentation. You may not like the final result that you see here, but with different textures and different layer styles, you can get a completely different result that you might like a little bit better. So I hope you guys liked this video. Leave a comment down below on what you'd like to see covered in a future video. Press that like button and make sure to check out my other Photoshop tutorials at IceflowStudios.com. Take care.